said, I'm the chief product officer at eero. So I lead our product management, design, hardware engineering, and software engineering teams. But my background is in software engineering. So hardware is a new space for me as we started eero. I met my two co-founders, Nick Weaver, who's our CEO, and Amos Shalik, who is our CTO, in college. Perhaps unsurprisingly and totally stereotypically, we all met at Stanford. And we were about 5 years out of college when Nick had the idea to start eero. He'd been working at a venture capital firm as an analyst and was looking at all different kinds of opportunities. And his initial thought was that there's a huge problem out there because in San Francisco, you have these long, skinny homes. Wi-Fi often comes in at one end of the home, but it doesn't extend all the way to the other end of the home. And so if you've got 3 or 4 people all crammed into one of these nice San Francisco Victorians, you'll have one person, one roommate at the front of the house who gets super great Wi-Fi. The people who live at the back of the house have terrible Wi-Fi. So what can we do to solve that problem? Amos and I were at a point in our careers where it made sense to give something a try. And we thought this was a fun opportunity. My background was in networking and computer security in grad school. So it was pretty unique to be able to work with friends on a problem that seemed really fun and deeply technical and also aligned with what I'd done in school. So I was really excited.
That's great. Thanks for sharing a little bit about the kind of the founding story. So you mentioned your background in software engineering. That's unusual for kind of the change notice crowd, who tend to be more on the hardware and manufacturing side. And so this is a unique opportunity for us to ask a burning question, which is, what do you think, based on kind of understanding how software organizations run, and then now having led organizations that include both software and hardware, how has that influenced how you run a hardware engineering team? What are things that like carry over from software to hardware that are actually really successful that maybe hardware folks who have only been in the hardware space and have never worked on a software team might not know or might not do? That's
a really good question. So there are a couple of process things that we've looked at that can help, but generally, we've talked about at eero in the past that hardware and software are just two different ends of a spectrum, where one, in hardware, iteration is a lot more costly. And so you put a lot more thought and effort into actually building a version of your product. Whereas in software, it's super cheap and easy to compile your code and test it out and run it. So you just go do it. And so you want to minimize the amount of gates there to go do something quickly. So we try and bring some of that into our prototyping experience. I don't say that we're perfect at that, but we really do try to minimize the bar to just prototyping and trying out new ideas and lowering the barrier to entry there. We've, on the tooling front, tried to do some mashups of version control, for example. So one of our super tenured electrical engineers uses Github to store all of our schematic and layout files, so that we have really nice version control as we go into each build before it actually goes into our PLM system. And we've also been trying over the course of the years to really get Jira integrated across hardware, software, and manufacturing. That's been super helpful with communicating with our factories and suppliers as well. But definitely, I think there's some innovation in that space that we're ripe for. It's not perfect. Got it. Awesome. Do you think, you kind of alluded to it a little bit, but maybe I'm reading between the lines. Do you think that there are like some, you kind of mentioned this, like lowering the barrier to prototyping on the hardware side, because that's kind of how software works. You kind of go and you build a prototype faster, and hardware tends to be kind of alluded to, like you got to sit down and think about it and kind of plan ahead, and like a lot more waterfall than agile. Are there any like pieces that, like, as someone who's led software teams, that like actually are really good from an agile hardware perspective, that translate well? Or yeah, it's hard. We also, so eero also, I think, benefited a lot from some early Apple DNA at the company. that really helped formalize a strong product development process.
Got it.
On the hardware front. So, I think in many ways we've actually seen some of the influence of hardware creeping into software more than vice versa.
Oh, interesting. Interesting. What have you seen there? If there's an example you can share.
Yeah, I think we see that happen in how we run programs and do phase gate reviews for large cross-functional programs. In part, when you're developing a product like an eero, where everything is interconnected and you've got software, yes, but you have mobile software and cloud software and device software all required to pull off a feature and deliver that to customers. You end up having different pieces of the software components that are able to iterate at different speeds. The device software certainly starts to iterate at a speed much more similar to hardware development. And so it's helpful to have some of those more formal phase gate reviews as you start to take a feature from concept through development and into production to make sure you're investing your limited engineering resources in the right way.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing. So you've now developed multiple generations of products over multiple years. What part of developing the first generation product was harder than you expected, and what part was easier?
So getting the first generation product to just boot reliably was the hardest thing. And I should start by saying that when we started eero, we didn't actually think we were going to build our own hardware. We came at this very much from a software side. And the original concept was, hey, we're going to go buy a bunch of $50 routers off of Amazon. And we're going to load them up with OpenWrt, which is an open source router distribution. And we're going to make some modifications to that to enable the super simple, easy to set up mesh configuration. And we backed into, oh, well, if we're going to do all these things and we're going to have a product that people are going to want to use and put on their shelves and display, and we want customers to have more than one of those in their home, we're probably going to have to go build our own version of it with our own custom ID. And so that meant that the very first proto boards that we built, we were still figuring out what the heck we were doing with hardware. And I remember we did the schematics over the course of a Thanksgiving. We got the layout done over December, built them in January, had them show up and thought, oh yeah, we're just going to power these things on. We're just going to turn them on and ta-da. And sure enough, it didn't work. We had resistors in the wrong place on one of the JTAG lines that was holding the CPU back and keeping it from booting. We actually ended up in a position where we had, some of the boards would boot some of the time, other boards would never boot at all. So that was a crazy process to try and debug. The part that was surprisingly easy, we were really nervous about tools for that very first product, the plastic tools, because we'd heard all these horror stories about you don't have much funding, injection mold tools are really expensive, and if you screw that up, you just run out of runway. You don't have money to go build another tool. You also don't have time to keep your team together to get your product to launch while you go build a new set of tools. So we got really fortunate with our industrial design team who steered us towards a relatively simple two-piece design to make it much easier for us to get to market. So I think our mechanical engineering team might give me some grief about this, but I think on the whole, there was a lot of work that went into it, but it was ultimately it went a lot more smoothly than the electricals and the RF for that first product.
It's kind of the irony that the thing that you thought was going to be easy was the thing that felt closer to like in the zone, and the thing that felt harder thing that was out of the zone, but you spent more time on that, so that turned out to be easier.
Yeah,
This classic
right.
startups of like, you only have enough bandwidth to kind of solve one major thing, and then the others all get, 50% engineering time.
Yeah, I think we benefited from just not knowing what we didn't know in that first program, because it was very much tunnel vision. Just you're going to the next problem, you're going to get through it, and then you get through it and you look at the next thing, you're like, oh, I don't know how we're going to get through this one. But we would have suffered from trying to solve all the problems all the time if we hadn't had some of that naivete.
Yeah. So many of our podcast listeners are engineering and operations leaders, and they're going to be tuning in because they're interested in you as a leader. And so drop some wisdom. What is something that you learned the hard way that you think peer leaders might benefit from knowing? Or a core principle that you really ascribe to, even if you think that's like generally something that is known?
Yeah, let's see. So I think one good core principle is there's no such thing as over communication. I think especially in a highly cross-functional product development process, there's no such thing as over communication, and increasing the transparency with your team is super important to build trust across the org. I think another thing that you said, things that we've learned the hard way. It takes, I think Amazon has been really good about instilling this practice that it's always day one. Your product's never good enough. You can always keep improving your core product. I think there have been times where you get super excited in the early days and you try and go big and you go broad, but ultimately, refining your core, you can always do better. And there's some magical, nuggets there that if you keep refining those, that's what your customers latch onto. That's what's going to build you that loyalty over time. And so continuing to iterate and refine and improve there is really important.
Is there a feature that is shipped and out in the world that you would put in that category that you feel like is an example of kind of that principle in action?
I think there are features that both we've shipped and features that we still haven't shipped that, are very much on that list of refining the core. So we've been hard at work over the past couple of years on a lot of our core just networking features. So doing a much better and better job at automatic channel selection. So Wi-Fi routers use on each one of their radios, they have to tune one of their radios to a particular Wi-Fi channel to broadcast and talk on. And similar to walkie-talkie, you want to have the cleanest channel that you don't have other people operating on. So you have a nice clear connection to the other Wi-Fi devices that you're trying to talk to. And so going through that process of refining that algorithm is something that we didn't get to until later in the history of eero. But I think it has definitely improved the product operation and performance for customers. And, as those of you who are eero teammates on the line and eero customers on the line, there's still a long list of other networking features that eero products still don't support. We can do a much better job with things like roaming. There's still a bunch of new kind of advanced networking features that customers ask about all the time. So we've got a healthy roadmap of stuff ahead.
Awesome. And so as far as I'm aware, eero continued to develop new product in 2020. Like, you guys didn't shut down your new product development teams. And so that's been a challenge for many on this call. And so what challenges did you encounter, and what changes will be permanent even after the pandemic, of what you can share, of course?
Yeah, well, 2020 was hard, and it's still going. It's still, even though we're here in the US and in the West Coast, we're starting to recover and start talking about return to office. It's still, for a lot of our teammates in Asia, And in Europe, it's not there yet. So give a lot of credit to the teams. It's been a ton of hard work just to continue to put one foot forward in front of the other over the course of the past year and almost year and a half at this point. So let's see. We did keep going. We didn't do it perfectly. We launched 2 products last year, the new eero Pro 6 and the eero 6. We took our portfolio and we released the Wi-Fi 6 version of it, which is the latest Wi-Fi technology, which was awesome. We had a super long EVT that was really hard because that was our first big build after the shutdowns hit. And so
that was a remote build or mostly remote?
It was mostly remote, figuring out how to communicate with our teammates on the ground in the factory and with our factory teammates over video conferencing, and the team in California working the night shift. That was a grind. So I think we've learned some process tweaks to help that this year. It's still not perfect. I think, there's obviously going to be a push and definitely consideration to say, well, does it make sense to travel all the time? And we can take some learnings from this time period to say, well, we now know how we can do some things better remotely. And so we don't need to have people travel necessarily all the time, but there's a ton of relationship building that happens when you're at the factory, whether it's with teammates from the US that you get to spend extra time with on the side, or the relationships you build with your factory partners that I think are really, really important to having a healthy team over the long term. So
do you think it would have been even harder to do last year if you were at a new factory without a team that you had? Maybe you were, but like without a team you had rapport with, like, did you dig into that rapport during this remote time?
Yeah, and there were changes. We hired a lot of new teammates too over the course of the past year. eero's growing, so if folks are looking for opportunities as well, we've hired a lot, and so I think that's added some challenges. It has been helpful to have the camaraderie and the chemistry of the existing team. I think having that leadership core has really helped. But it's hard. It's really hard. There's no way around that.
All right, awesome. Well, so that's the kind of the conclusion of this like formal part of the session.